AP Biology consists of essential concepts spread over 8 units and 6 science practices spiraled across these units. Science practices we know are central to the study of biology, and this lesson will introduce you to questions and methods, an important science practice on the AP exam. So let's get the basics. First, to begin, we start discussing the components of a scientific test. Now, what should a scientific test or an experiment include? Now, we know most experiments originate from, say, an observation, which leads to a scientific question. This question drives your investigation. So, what are the components of a scientific test or an investigation? We have hypothesis, the independent variable, dependent variable, control variables, experimental group, and a control group. So, let's look at each of these in a little more detail. Hypothesis is simply an educated guess, a prediction that is made about the outcome of an experiment. So you would do this before you actually start your investigation. We generally put it up as an if-then statement. So what's an independent variable? It's a variable or a factor that is being tested. Dependent variable is a variable that is predicted to change in response to your independent variable. And remember, this variable is the one that you are measuring, and it depends on the independent variable, not vice versa. We will look at an example to actually put this into practice. So what's a constant? Constants are also called control variables, the variables that are kept same across the experimental and the control groups. Experimental group is a group that receives the independent variable, while the control group is a group that does not include the independent variable. Now, let's look at an example. And just before we get into the example, control group, remember, is the group that provides a baseline and lets the experimenter see if the independent variable has had an effect. Okay, so let's look at an example. Assume that we are investigating the effect of fertilizer concentration on the growth of bean plants. So our research question is, how does the concentration of fertilizer affect the height of bean plants? That's our research question. Based on that question, we come up with an educated guess, a prediction, which is called the hypothesis. So remember, hypothesis generally is put up as an if-then statement, but it's not always mandatory. So what we would predict is that as fertilizer concentration increases, the height of bean plants will also increase. So that's our hypothesis. And we're going to check our hypothesis against the final outcome of our experiment, the results of our experiment. Now, coming to the independent variable and dependent variable. Remember, independent variable is what you are testing, or the variable that you change. And dependent variable is a variable that you are measuring, the variable that you measure. From a question or from a hypothesis, it's very easy to figure out what your independent variable is, what your dependent variable is. So if you see if you look at the hypothesis or the question, you clearly see that we are testing if fertilizer concentration changes, how does that affect the height of bean plants? So what are we changing? What are we testing for? We are testing for the concentration of fertilizer. So that's our independent variable. All right. And we're measuring the height of bean plants over a period of time. And that's therefore the dependent variable. Okay. So you will clearly see that your hypothesis, your question does include the independent variable and the dependent variable. So a good way to remember this is just remember IVC and DVM. Independent variable is what you change, and dependent variable is what you measure. Now, going ahead, this is how you would probably set up the experiment about how fertilizer concentration is affecting the height of bean plants. Now, if you look at this experimental setup right here, we have 4 different groups, all right, 4 setups, identical setups. What's different is, the control group and the experimental group. So what's the control group? If you can recall, control group is the group that does not receive the independent variable. And what's the independent variable in our experiment? We know it's the concentration of fertilizer. So your control group does not receive any fertilizer. So 0 gram fertilizer. So that's our control group, no fertilizer. While the rest of the groups, the remaining 3 groups with different concentrations, because our purpose was not just to find out is fertilizer improving or increasing plant growth. If that was the case, then we would just have one with fertilizer, one without fertilizer. But our purpose of the investigation is, does fertilizer concentration have an effect on plant growth? So for this reason, we're using one with, say, a 0.5 gram fertilizer, the other one with 1 gram fertilizer, and the third one with a 2 gram fertilizer. That's a concentration, okay? So remember, the control group is a group that does not receive the fertilizer, while the experimental group is the group, or are the groups that receive the independent variable. All right. Now, any good experiment will make sure that you are controlling the remaining variables or the factors that would likely affect your experimental outcome. Now, a good experiment, remember, would change just that independent variable, keeping the rest of the factors constant. Now, what else could affect the growth of plants, the height of these bean plants over a period of time? Probably the type of plant that you use, the number of plants that you probably put up in that beaker or the cup, the type of fertilizer used, the amount of fertilizer, the amount of the water that you're giving to each of these plants, the intensity of light, the temperature, the type of soil. So there can be n number of things that you would want to keep constant. So if you've taken care of most of them or all of those constants, your experimental results will be more reliable. Okay, so this is what concludes our lesson for today. Thank you for watching.